The Arizona sky bled out, spilling crimson and gold across a land that had forgotten the color green. The sun, a merciless tyrant, had torched the plains for months, leaving nothing but cracked earth and brittle scrub. This was Jedodiah Stone's kingdom, a kingdom of dust and silence. For 10 years, he had lived this way, alone. His only conversations were with his horse, Dusty, a stoic wrangling who understood silence better than most men understood words. Ahead of them, the mountain stood like a jagged black wall against the dying light. That was the line, the boundary he had drawn a decade ago and never crossed. Behind him, the splintered wood and tired roof of his ranch sagged against the horizon, a monument to a life deliberately left empty. Jed had once had a family. He had a wife, Sarah, whose laugh sounded like creek water tumbling over smooth stones. He had a son, Leo, a boy with wide, curious eyes that tried to drink in the whole world at once. But fire is a greedy thing. It takes and leaves nothing but ash and memory. After the fire, Jed had fled, not from the law, but from the ghosts of laughter in a silent house. He cut the ties, burned the letters, and turned his back on a world that had taken everything. Now his only inheritance was the wind, the dust, and his father's gun. An old cult peacemaker, heavy with a legacy Jed wanted no part of. It sat above the cold fireplace, untouched, its polished steel gathering a thin film of dust, just like his heart. 10 years was a long time to be alone, long enough to forget the sound of your own voice, long enough for the quiet to become a presence, a heavy blanket that smothered thought and feeling alike. He swung down from Dusty the familiar creak of saddle leather. The only sound in the vast emptiness, the routine, was his armor. Feed the horse, check the water trough, walk the fence line. Simple tasks for a simple life. Each movement was measured, automatic, honed by 3,650 days of repetition. It was in the middle of this ritual, his hand on a loose fence post, that he saw it. A flicker, a shimmer in the heat haze that danced above the plain. Jed squinted, his eyes accustomed to the glare. A trick of the light. A coyote. Maybe the heat did strange things to a man's eyes. Made him see things that weren't there. He'd seen phantom riders and ghost cattle in the midday sun. He turned back to his work, his jaw set. He had no time for phantoms, but the flicker remained. It wasn't a trick. It was moving, stumbling, lurching forward with a desperate, unnatural gait. It was too small to be a man, too upright to be an animal. A cold knot tightened in Jed's stomach. Trouble in the West always came on 2 feet. He left the fence and walked toward the shape, his steps slow and deliberate, his hand hovering near the worn grip of his own sidearm. A simple, functional weapon, not the storied relic his father had left him. The figure grew clearer with every step. Not a phantom, not a mirage. It was real. It was a girl. He stopped, maybe 20 yards away. She couldn't have been more than 17. Her dress was torn, her hair a tangled mess of dust and twigs, but it was her hands and feet that made Jed's breath catch in his throat. Her wrists were bound together with a thick, rough rope that had rubbed her skin raw, and her feet. Her bare feet were a canvas of cuts and bruises, leaving faint crimson kisses on the parched earth with every agonizing step. She stumbled again, her knees buckling, and fell into the dust. For a long moment, she didn't move. The wind whispered around them, carrying the scent of sagebrush and a faint coppery smell that Jed knew all too well. It was the smell of blood. Slowly, she pushed herself up, her thin shoulders shaking with the effort. She hadn't seen him yet. She was just a creature of pure, blind survival, pushing forward with no destination in sight. Jed stood frozen, a statue carved from a decade of solitude. Every instinct screamed at him right away. This is not your fight. This is how it starts. With one stranger, one plea for help. This is how the world you shut out finds its way back in. But he didn't move. He just watched the girl. A ghost of a memory flickering in his mind. The memory of a boy with curious eyes, and a promise he had made to protect him. A promise that had turned to ash in his mouth. The world had just walked up to his gate, bleeding and broken. And Jedodiah Stone knew with a certainty that chilled him to the bone that his 10 years of peace were about to end. If you're enjoying this story, comment with a 1 and subscribe to help us reach 10,000 strong. It gives us the fuel to keep these Wild West stories coming. Now Jed's got a choice to make, and it's a hard one. His feet felt rooted to the earth, tangled in the ghosts of a decade's worth of solitude. The world had just walked up to his gate, bleeding and broken. And Jedodiah Stone knew with a certainty that chilled him to the bone that his 10 years of peace were about to end. He remained motionless as the girl tried to push herself up, her arms trembling under the strain. Dust caked her face, turning the tracks of dried tears into muddy rivers on her cheeks. Her eyes, wide and dark, finally found him. They were the eyes of a spooked deer, cornered and expecting the killing blow. He saw every detail with a hunter's precision. The deep, angry chafe marks from the rope, the swell of a bruise darkening on her jaw, the way she flinched when his shadow fell over her. A voice in his head, cold and hard and practical, spoke with the authority of long practice. It was the voice that had kept him alive. "Walk away, Jed. Now this is bait. There are 3 more with rifles waiting in the rocks. You've seen this before. You know how this story ends." The voice wasn't lying. The memory rose in him, unbidden and sharp as a shard of glass. The smell of pine smoke turning acrid. The cheerful orange glow against the night sky that wasn't the sunrise, but the hungry flames devouring his barn. His life. He remembered the sound, not the roar of the fire, but the crackle of the dry timbers punctuated by the high, terrified scream of his horses. He remembered the feeling of helpless rage, a wild animal trapped in his own chest as he stood with an empty bucket, realizing it was all gone. Sarah, Leo, gone. All because he trusted the smiling faces of strangers. Because he'd ignored the knot in his gut that told him their story of a broken wagon wheel was too clean, too neat. Kindness had been his undoing. It was a luxury a man in this land could not afford. And look at her. The voice sneered, pulling him back to the present. She's half dead already. Whatever she's running from is close behind. Do you want them at your door? Do you want to smell that smoke again? The girl's lips parted, but only a dry, rasping sound came out, like stones scraping together. She swallowed the effort of visible agony in her slender throat. He could see the pulse beating frantically there. A tiny, frightened bird trapped beneath her skin. "Water," she finally whispered, the words so faint it was nearly stolen by the wind. "Please." The sound sliced through the wall of ice he had built around his heart. It was the first human voice other than his own muttered curses that he had heard on this land in years. It was fragile. It was breaking. It was a plea, not a demand. And it was everything he had sworn to shut out. His hand, which had been hovering near his gun, dropped to his side. He didn't move. He was a rock, a part of the landscape. Rocks don't feel. They don't help. They endure. Leave her. The voice of survival hissed, more insistent now. The buzzards have to eat too. This is the desert's way. The strong survive. The weak become a meal. This is not your concern. Not anymore. "You alone?" he asked. The words felt alien on his tongue, rough and rusty from disuse. It was a test, the final test. He watched her eyes, his own narrowed, searching for the flicker of a lie, the telltale sign of a partner waiting in the wings. He was ready for it, eager for it. A lie would make this easy. A lie would let him turn his back and walk away. His conscience clear, but her gaze didn't waver. It just fell apart. The fear, the fight, the last shred of defiance seemed to dissolve, leaving behind something terrifyingly pure, utter, bottomless desperation. It was the look of someone who had run so far past the end of their hope that they had forgotten how to lie. The look of someone who knew they were about to die and was making one last hopeless appeal to a world that had already forsaken them. In her eyes, he didn't see deceit. He saw the reflection of the same vast, unforgiving emptiness that surrounded them. It was a loneliness that mirrored his own. And then he saw something else, something deeper. He saw a flicker of a spirit that refused to be extinguished. It was buried under layers of pain and terror, but it was there. It was the opposite of the cold, empty eyes of the men who had betrayed him. Their eyes had been full of calculation. Hers were full of a terrible honesty. Something inside Jedodiah broke. A 10-year-old dam of grief and fury and self-imposed exile, cracked by a single look and a single whispered word. He thought of Leo, of his son's small hand in his. He thought of a promise he had made to Sarah, a promise to always be the good man she believed he was. He had failed that promise. He had buried that man under 10 years of dust and silence. But in that moment, staring at the dying girl, a flicker of that man stirred with a long, shuddering sigh that seemed to carry the weight of a decade. He moved. The decision wasn't made in his head. It was made in his gut, in a place he thought had died long ago. It was a betrayal of every rule he had lived by, and he knew it. He walked back to Dusty, the horse watching him with placid, intelligent eyes, as if to say, "About time." He untied the canteen from his saddle horn, the water sloshing inside a sound of life in the deadening quiet. He pulled the hunting knife from the sheath on his belt, its blade clean and sharp, a tool he'd only ever used for skinning game and cutting rope. He knelt beside her. The dust puffed up around his knees. She flinched as he approached, trying to scramble backward, a wounded animal recoiling from the boot that might end it. "Stay still," he said, his voice softer this time. Though still rough around the edges, he had to force the gentleness. It didn't come easy anymore. He reached for her bound wrists, Her skin was hot, feverish. He carefully slid the blade under the thick, grimy rope. The fibers parting with a dry snap, the tension released, and her hands fell limply to her sides. The raw red welts exposed to the air. She stared at them, her expression blank, as if she couldn't believe they were free. Jed capped the canteen and held it out to her. "Slow," he commanded. "Just a little." Her hands shook so badly she could barely hold it. He steadied it for her as she brought it to her cracked lips. She drank, not like a person, but like the parched earth itself, taking in the water with a desperate, all-consuming thirst. She choked, coughed, and drank again, water spilling down her chin and onto the front of her torn dress, leaving dark patches in the dust. She didn't stop until he gently pulled the canteen away. "That's enough for now," he said. She looked up at him, her eyes still hazy with pain. But for the first time, the terror had receded, replaced by a flicker of confusion, of disbelief. Jed watched her, the cold knot in his stomach replaced by a dull, familiar ache, the ache of compassion. The ache he had tried to kill for 10 years, but had only managed to bury alive. "You ain't the first person to wander out here looking for trouble," he muttered. The words meant more for himself than for her. He had opened the door. He had let the world in. Now he would have to face the consequences. She's just a girl. Or is she? Comment with a 2 if you think there's more to her story than she's letting on. Because trouble follows a story like a shadow follows a man. He had opened the door. He had let the world in. Now he would have to face the consequences. Jed got to his feet, the motion stiff, the silence between them stretched, filled only by the girl's ragged breathing and the lonely cry of a distant hawk. He felt an overwhelming urge to saddle Dusty and ride to leave her there with the canteen and let the desert decide her fate. It would be the smart thing to do, the safe thing. But the image of her collapsed in the dust. The raw hope in her eyes when she drank the water. It had thrown a wrench into the cold, predictable machinery of his life. "Can you stand?" he asked, his voice flat. She nodded, though her limbs still trembled with exhaustion. He watched as she tried to rise, her legs buckling beneath her with a sigh that sounded like gravel turning over. He stepped forward and hooked a hand under her arm. The contact was jarring. Her skin was fever hot through the thin, torn fabric of her dress. She was lighter than he expected. Almost nothing. A bundle of skin and bone held together by a thread of stubborn will. He hated the feeling of another person's weight leaning on him. The unwelcome echo of a time when he had been a husband and a father, a man who carried others' burdens. He helped her toward the ranch, Dusty trailing behind them like a beautiful shadow. The journey was only 100 yards, but it felt like a mile. Each step was a silent argument in Jed's mind. This is a mistake. She brings death with her. You can feel it. But his feet kept moving forward toward the broken-down porch and the faded wood of his front door. To her, the place must have looked like the end of the world. A forgotten outpost of humanity, weathered and worn down by the sun and the wind. But as he led her inside, he saw a flicker of relief in her eyes. It was shelter, 4 walls and a roof. Compared to the open plain, it was a palace. The inside wasn't much better. The main room was sparse, functional, stripped of any comfort or joy. A single straight-back chair sat at a small scarred table. A single tin plate and cup lay beside a cold stove. A bedroll was tucked into a corner. It was the room of a man who wasn't living, merely existing. He eased her into the chair, the only one he owned, and pulled away as if he'd been burned. He moved with a grim purpose, fetching a bucket of water from the well and a bottle of whiskey. He kept for snake bites in the rare dark nights when the memories grew too loud. He tore a strip from a clean flour sack. He didn't ask permission. He knelt and began to clean the cuts on her feet. She hissed in pain as the whiskey bit into the raw flesh, but she didn't pull away. He worked with a detached, clinical efficiency. His movements precise, his face a hard mask. He was a rancher tending to wounded stock. Nothing more. That's what he told himself. But he couldn't ignore the trust in the way she held still for him. The silent surrender that felt more dangerous than any threat. When he was done, he stood and moved to the stove. He lit a fire, the crackle and pop of the kindling and intrusion into the room's profound silence. He put a pot of coffee on to boil and tossed a few strips of dried venison into a pan. The smell of food filled the small space, a smell he hadn't associated with another person in a decade. She watched him, her dark eyes following his every move. Finally she spoke, her voice still hoarse but stronger now. "My name is Alara." Jed grunted in acknowledgement but didn't turn around. Names were a complication. "The men who took me," she continued, her voice faltering. "Their leader, his name is Blackwood. Silus Blackwood." Jed stopped. The pan held motionless over the flames. The name meant nothing to him. but the way she said it with a mixture of pure terror and cold hatred told him everything he needed to know. "They burned our village," she whispered, and Jed's back went rigid. "They took the young ones, said we were worth more alive for a while." Her story came out in broken pieces, fragments of a nightmare. She spoke of being herded like cattle, of the casual cruelty of her captors, of the other girls who hadn't been strong enough to survive the journey. He listened, his face turned away from her, but every word landed like a blow. They knew men like Blackwood. They were predators who wore human skin. Men who saw the world as something to be taken and broken for their own pleasure. He served the food on the single tin plate and slid it in front of her. He poured 2 cups of black coffee, then stood leaning against the far wall, drinking his. The silence returned thicker this time, heavy with her unspoken story and his own buried ghosts. It was then, as the last of the light faded outside and the oil lamp cast long dancing shadows, that her gaze drifted past him. It moved across the bare walls, the dust motes dancing in the lamplight, and finally came to rest on the fireplace mantel. She went completely still. Her fork clattered onto the plate. Her eyes, which had been dull with exhaustion, widened. But it wasn't with fear. It was with a sudden, sharp intake of breath, a look of utter, staggering disbelief, of awe. "That gun," she whispered, her voice trembling. Jed's gaze followed hers to the old, cold peacemaker. It rested on 2 wooden pegs, its silver finish gleaming softly in the lamplight. It was the only beautiful thing in the room, the only thing he cared for with any reverence. It can't be," she breathed. "That star carved into the handle." She pushed her chair back and took a shaky step toward the fireplace, as if drawn by an invisible force. It belonged to Marshall Stone. The name hit Jed like a physical blow, a ghost from another lifetime. No one had called his father that in 20 years. No one alive even knew that name, or so he had thought. His easy suspicion, which had been lulled by her vulnerability, came roaring back, sharp and cold. "How do you know that name?" he demanded, his voice low and dangerous. He pushed himself off the wall, his own hand dropping instinctively to his sidearm. Ara didn't seem to notice his change in demeanor. She was staring at the gun as if it were a holy relic. Marshall Stone. He was a legend in our parts," she said, her voice filled with a child's wonder. "Years ago, before I was born, a gang, the Red River Raiders. They were bleeding the whole territory dry. No one could stop them. And then he came. One man, they said he faced down 10 of them in the middle of town and didn't even flinch. He saved our village. He saved everyone." Answering, she turned to face Jed, and now her eyes were shining with tears. But they were not tears of sorrow. They were tears of impossible dawning hope. "My grandfather told me the story 100 times. He said the marshal was justice made real, that as long as his gun was in the world, there was still hope. When they dragged me from my home, I thought that hope was dead." She took another step closer, her gaze locked on his. "When I saw that gun," she said, her voice dropping to a reverent whisper, I knew fate hadn't abandoned me." She raised a trembling hand and pointed not at the gun, but at him. It brought me to his son. Jed stood frozen, trapped in the intensity of her gaze. He looked from her earnest, tear-streaked face to the heavy, silent gun on the mantel. The gun he had refused to touch. The legacy he had spent 10 years trying to outrun. It had found him. The past wasn't just a memory anymore. It was standing in his cabin, bleeding on his floor, looking at him not as Jed the hermit, but as the son of a hero. It was looking at him with expectation. And the weight of that legacy, of that unwanted destiny, settled on his shoulders, heavier and more inescapable than any mountain, a marshal's son and a marshal's gun. Destiny has found him. If you feel the weight of that legacy, hit that like button and make sure you're subscribed so you don't miss what happens. Comment with a 3 if you think he must take up his father's gun, because the past is about to come knocking and it won't be polite. He looked from her earnest, tear-streaked face to the heavy, silent gun on the mantel, the gun he had refused to touch. The legacy he had spent 10 years trying to outrun. It had found him. The past wasn't just a memory anymore. It was standing in his cabin, bleeding on his floor, looking at him not as Jed the hermit, but as the son of a hero. It was looking at him with expectation. And the weight of that legacy, of that unwanted destiny, settled on his shoulders, heavier and more inescapable than any mountain. A cold anger, sharp and familiar, rose in Jed's throat. It was anger at the girl for bringing this to his door, at the world for refusing to leave him be, but mostly at the ghost of his father for casting a shadow so long it could find him even here, at the edge of nowhere. "That man is dead," Jed said, his voice a low growl. The words were meant to be a wall, a final slam door. "He's been dead a long time, and that gun is just a piece of metal." He turned his back on her, on the gun, on the impossible hope in her eyes. He began to pace the small room, his boots thudding on the wooden floorboards like a drumbeat of doom. 10 years. For 10 years, he had built this quiet, empty life. He had earned it with blood and grief. He would not let it be torn down by some half-forgotten legend and a runaway girl. He had made his choice long ago. He was no one's hero. He was no one's son. He was just a man who wanted to be left alone. Ara said nothing. She didn't argue or plead. She just stood there, her silence, a more powerful accusation than any words could be. It was the silence of a truth he could not deny. And then it came. A sound that cut through the night, through his anger, through the thick walls of the cabin. It was faint at first, a rhythmic beat so low he felt it more than heard it. The thud of horse hooves on hard-packed earth. Jed froze mid-step. Every muscle in his body went rigid. The hermit vanished, replaced instantly by the man who had survived. His head snapped up, his eyes darting to the single grimy window. His hearing honed by a decade of listening to the subtleties of the wild, strained to interpret the sound. 3 horses, maybe 4, moving at a steady pace, not a gallop. They weren't just passing through, they were searching. "Get up!" he hissed, all trace of emotion gone from his voice, replaced by cold, hard command. Now the fear returned to Ara's eyes, stark and immediate. She saw the change in him, the sudden, terrifying competence. She scrambled to her feet. He didn't explain. There was no time. He grabbed her by the arm, not gently this time, and half-dragged her toward a low, narrow door at the back of the cabin. It led to a small, dark tack room that smelled of old leather, hay, and dust. He shoved her inside. "Get behind those sacks," he ordered in a whisper that was more menacing than a shout. He pointed to a pile of feed sacks in the corner. "Don't move. Don't make a sound. Don't even breathe if you can help it. Understand?" She nodded frantically. Her eyes wide in the gloom and scrambled into the corner, disappearing into the shadows. Jed slipped back into the main room, moving with a silent, fluid grace that belied his size. He blew out the oil lamp, plunging the cabin into near total darkness, save for the faint silvery light of the moon filtering through the window. He grabbed the rifle he kept propped by the door, his own weapon, not his father's, and flattened himself against the wall beside the window, peering through a tiny gap in the wood. The hoof-beats grew louder, closer. Then they stopped right in his yard. He heard the creak of saddle leather, the jingle of spurs, the low murmur of men's voices. 3 of them, their dark shapes, moved in the moonlight like vultures circling a carcass. "This is the place," one of them said, his voice rough. "Tracks led right here. Don't look like much." A second voice grumbled. "Probably just some old prospector dead inside." Blackwood said to check every last homestead. The first voice snapped back. "He wants the girl." Jed's knuckles whitened on the stock of his rifle. He could take 1, maybe 2, before the third got a shot off. But it would be messy, and it would bring more of them. He heard heavy boots on his porch. A fist hammered on the door, the sound echoing through the small cabin like a cannon shot. Jed held his breath. Ara, hidden in the tack room, must have heard it too. He prayed she would remember his warning. Silence. "Ain't nobody home," the second voice said. "Kick it in," the first commanded. The door shuddered in its frame as a boot crashed against it. It held. Jed braced himself, but instead of kicking it again, he heard them move away. Their boots scraped on the dirt as they circled the house. A beam of light from a lantern swept across the window, momentarily blinding him. He heard them at the back of the cabin, their voices muffled. A heavy thud sounded against the tack room door. Jed's heart stopped. He imagined Alara huddled in the darkness, inches away from discovery, from the men she had escaped. Then the lead voice, closer now, spoke the words that turned Jed's blood to ice. "Just make sure you find her. Blackwood wants her alive." The man chuckled. A low, ugly sound. Said, "She knows something. Something about where her people hide their gold. He wants to hear her tell him herself, right before he quiets her down for good." So that was it. Not just cruelty, greed, a lie about hidden gold that would get her and anyone associated with her killed. "Nothing here." Another voice called out. "Place is a tomb. Let's go." Jed listened as they mounted their horses. The sound of their voices and the jingle of their gear faded into the night. The hoof-beats slowly dissolving back into the silence they had shattered. He waited a full 5 minutes, every nerve screaming before he moved. He crept to the door of the tack room and eased it open. All was still huddled in the corner, a pale shape in the darkness. She was shaking so hard he could hear her teeth chattering. He walked back to the center of the room and reached the lamp, his hands steady. The warm glow filled the cabin again. But the safety it offered was a lie. The sanctuary had been breached. His fortress of solitude had been nothing but a house of cards, and the wind was starting to blow. All emerged from the tack room, her arms wrapped around herself. "They'll be back," she whispered, stating the obvious. "I know," Jed said, his back still to her. "We can't stay here." "I know." He stood staring at the gun on the mantel, its silver finish seeming to mock him in the lamplight. His 10 years of running were over. They had tracked her here. They would come back, and they would come back in force. His quiet life was finished one way or another. He could hand her over, or he could die protecting her. And then Ara's voice, quiet but clear, offered a third option, an impossible one. "My father, he used to trade with the Apache. There's a village hidden deep in the canyons." "Your father," she said, her voice careful. "He knew the way. He saved their chief's son once. They owe him a debt, a legacy." The past wasn't just haunting him anymore. It was offering him a lifeline, a path forward that led directly through the life he had abandoned. It was a bitter, terrible irony. To survive, he had to become the very thing he had spent a decade trying to forget. The son of Marshal Stone. He finally turned to face her. The conflict was over. There was no choice left. There was only the cold, hard reality of what had to be done. The men's ugly laughter echoed in his mind. He wants to hear her tell him herself. "Get your things," Jed said, his voice flat and devoid of all emotion, but carrying a new grim finality. "There aren't any," he nodded. "Of course there weren't." "Then get ready," he commanded. "We leave before dawn. They're on the run with predators on their trail. Will they make it to the Apache sanctuary? Comment with a 4 if you're riding with them, because Blackwood's men are close behind and the desert doesn't give up its secrets easily." "Then get ready," he commanded. "We leave before dawn." There was no more sleep that night. The darkness before dawn was a cold, starred shroud. Jed moved with a grim, silent efficiency, gathering what little they would need: a rifle, a box of cartridges, a bedroll, and the last of his dried venison. He saddled Dusty in the spare horse, a skittish buckskin he rarely used. He watched as Lara, moving with a weary stiffness, found a discarded burlap sack and filled it with a few handfuls of oats and the leftover coffee. She didn't complain. She didn't ask questions. She simply prepared, her movements echoing his own quiet urgency. They rode out as the first hint of gray lightened the eastern sky. Jed set a hard pace, pushing them south, away from the direction Blackwood's men had taken toward the broken lands and jagged canyons that led to the high country. For the first day, he treated her as cargo, a problem to be managed. He rode ahead, his back a rigid wall of disapproval, his eyes constantly scanning the horizon, the rock formations, the washes. Every shadow held a threat. Every gust of wind sounded like approaching horses. The land was an enemy. It offered no water, no shelter, only rock and thorn and blistering sun. By midday, their water was half gone. Jed's face was a mask of grim calculation. He knew his own limits, but he didn't know hers. He expected her to falter to slow him down, but she didn't. Late in the afternoon, as he was about to make a dry camp, she spoke for the first time in hours. "There," she said, her voice raspy, pointing to a narrow, almost invisible cleft in a rock face. He had been about to ride past a seep spring. "On the north face of the rock, the plants are greener there." Jed stopped. He looked where she pointed and saw it. A faint dark stain on the rock, a small cluster of stubborn green plants clinging to life. He would have missed it completely. He said nothing, but he turned his horse and led them into the cleft. The water was a slow, steady drip, but it was clean and cold. It was life. As they refilled their cantons, he looked at her. Really looked at her. She wasn't just a victim. She had seen the land in a way he, in his self-imposed blindness, had not. A grudging respect, hard and unwelcome, began to take root in him. The journey changed after that. He still rode in front, but the distance between them shortened. He found himself listening for the sound of her horse, for the quiet observations she would make. She knew which plants were good for a puss, which berries were safe to eat. She had been raised in this hard country, and its lessons were written in her blood. Slowly, without a word being spoken, their dynamics shifted. It was no longer a man leading a refugee. It was two survivors moving as one. On the third day, they reached the canyons. She led him through a maze of red rock and towering spires, a world of stone and sky. The entrance to the Apache village was invisible. A crack in a canyon wall, hidden by a rock slide, and a curtain of ancient gnarled junipers. It was a path that only a friend would be shown. Inside, the world changed. The narrow canyon opened into a hidden valley, green and alive. A clear stream ran through it, and small fields of corn and squash grew in the sunlight. The air smelled of wood smoke and roasting meat. Children played by the stream, their laughter echoing off the canyon walls. It was a place of life, a community, a sanctuary. It was everything his own ranch was not. The sight of it was a physical blow, a stark reminder of all he had lost, all he had run from. An Apache sentinel, silent and watchful, led them to the center of the village. The people stopped what they were doing and watched them pass. Their faces unreadable, but their eyes sharp with curiosity. They were led to a lodge larger than the others, where an old man sat by a fire. His face was a map of deep lines. His long gray hair was tied back with a simple leather thong, and his eyes held the wisdom of a man who has seen 100 seasons come and go. This was Chief Kyle. Kale's eyes scanned with a flicker of compassion, then settled on Jed. He took in the worn clothes, the sun-scorched face, the hard set of his jaw. Then his gaze lifted to the old Colt Peacemaker, still hanging over Jed's fireplace. A gun that existed now only in Jed's memory. But Kale saw it as if it were there, strapped to Jed's hip. "I know that look," the old chief said, his voice low and steady. "Like the river? You have the eyes of your father," Jed said. Nothing but a muscle twitched in his jaw. All stepped forward. "This is Jedodiah Stone," she said. "He is the son of Marshall Stone." Kale nodded slowly, as if confirming something he already knew. "Your father was a just man," he said, looking directly at Jed. "He stood with my people when it would have been easier to stand against us. There is a debt." He turned to his warriors who had gathered. "The girl will have shelter. The son of Stone will have our counsel." That night, they gave him food and a place by their fire. But Jed didn't rest. He watched. He watched the Apache warriors. He saw them sharpening knives, cleaning rifles, checking their bows. They spoke in low, determined tones. He saw no fear in their eyes. He saw anger, yes, but beneath it was a fierce, protective love. He saw men preparing to fight not for gold or glory, but for the children playing by the stream, for the women tending the fires, for the very existence of their hidden home. He was seeing a mirror image of his own past, twisted and broken. They were preparing to face the fire. He had run from it. And in that moment, watching the quiet, resolute strength of the Apache, something fundamental shifted inside him. He finally understood. His decade of solitude hadn't been peace. It hadn't been a fortress. It had been a surrender. He had let the fire win. He had honored the dead by ceasing to live. He stood up and walked away from the fire, back to the small lodge they had given him. He stood in the darkness, the sounds of the village, a low hum around him. He thought of his own cold, silent cabin. He thought of the gun above the fireplace, a museum piece, a monument to a better man. Slowly, as if in a trance, he reached for his hip. But the gun he carried was just a tool. It had no story. It had no soul. The gun that mattered, the one that Kale had seen in his eyes, was miles away. But its weight was suddenly, crushingly real in his hand. He closed his eyes. The hermit, the man who had hidden from the world for 10 years, died in that hidden valley. He died in the firelight of the Apache camp. When Jed opened his eyes, the man looking out was different. The emptiness was gone, replaced by a cold, burning purpose. He was no longer Jedodiah Stone, the rancher who lived at the edge of the world. He was the son of Marshall Stone, and his war was just beginning. The hermit is gone. The son of a lawman is back. If you're ready for the fight, smash that like button and subscribe for more justice from the frontier. Comment 5 if you think it's time for a reckoning, because the hunt is over and the war is about to begin. He was the son of Marshall Stone, and his war was just beginning. The council of war was held by the light of a low, flickering fire. There were no maps, only a patch of dirt smoothed over by Kale's hand. The old chief drew lines in the dust with a stick, his movements economical and precise. Ara knelt beside him, her fear replaced by a cold, focused anger. She described the layout of Blackwood's camp, a repurposed mining outpost nestled in a box canyon pinpointing the guard posts, the tent where the prisoners were held, and Blackwood's own lodge. Jed stood with the warriors, a silent shadow among them. He listened, absorbing every detail. When Alara finished, he spoke, his voice low and steady. His men are trackers, but they're lazy. They look for the easy trail. They won't be expecting anyone to come from the high rocks from the east. The approach is treacherous, but it will put us above them. Kale looked at Jed. A flicker of his father's strategic mind reflected in his son's eyes. He nodded slowly. The spirits of the rocks will hide our approach. We moved tonight. There were 12 of them. A small war party against a force twice their size. But they were Apache, moving on their own land, and Jed, a man who had made a friend of the darkness. They moved out under a sliver of moon, shadows within shadows. The world was a place of black, rock, and silver starlight. Every step was placed with care, every sound muffled. The only noise was the whisper of the wind through the canyons and the pounding of Jed's own heart in his ears. He felt a clarity he hadn't known in 10 years. The gnawing emptiness inside him was gone, filled now with a sharp, cold purpose. He was no longer running from his past. He was running toward a reckoning. He looked over at Ara, moving as silently as any of the Apache warriors, her face set with determination. She was no longer a victim to be saved. She was a soldier in this war, fighting for the ghosts of her own village. After hours of climbing and navigating treacherous ledges, they reached the ridge overlooking Blackwood's camp. It was a scar on the land, a dirty, sprawling collection of tents and crude structures lit by the orange glow of a few dying fires. The air carried the stink of stale whiskey and unwashed men. Jed could see the guards. They were lax, hunched over, sharing a bottle, their attention on the main canyon entrance, not on the sheer cliffs above them. Kale gave the signal, a soft hoot of an owl that was answered by his men. They descended like ghosts, using ropes to navigate the steepest parts of the cliff face. Jed moved with them, his rifle strapped to his back, every sense on fire. They reached the canyon floor in silence, melting into the shadows at the edge of the camp. The plan was simple, brutal, and swift. Jed, all Kale would create a diversion at the main tent, while the warriors dealt with the sentries and freed the prisoners. The first part was silent perfection, a thrown knife, the whisper of a drawn blade, a muffled grunt. 2 sentries fell without making a sound. The Apache warriors moved like wraiths toward the crude stockade, where a handful of dazed, hollow-eyed prisoners were kept. Jed moved toward Blackwood's tent, his rifle now in his hands. Hay felt close behind him. A small bow clutched in her hand. The air was thick with tension. A moment stretched thin, ready to snap. And then it did. A dolbaku. A sharp, frantic sound. A man shouted in surprise. Suddenly, a signal flare shot into the night sky, bursting in a shower of brilliant white light. It bathed the entire canyon in a harsh, unforgiving glare, turning every shadow into a target. It was a trap. Jed's blood ran cold. Blackwood had been waiting for them. The night exploded. Gunshots erupted from all sides. Not from within the camp, but from the cliffs above. From the very rocks they had used for cover. Muzzle flashes winked like malevolent stars in the darkness. Men yelled. War cries mixed with screams. A bullet whizzed past Jed's ear, close enough for him to feel its heat. Another struck the ground at his feet, kicking up a spray of dirt. Cows rained it. The Apache warriors, caught in the open, returned fire, taking cover behind rocks and water troughs. But they were pinned down, caught in a deadly crossfire. Jed shoved Alara behind a stack of crates. "Stay down!" he yelled over the deafening roar of gunfire. He raised his rifle and fired at a muzzle flash on the ridge, the weapon bucking against his shoulder. A man screamed and fell from view. He worked the lever, chambering another round, firing again. But for every man he targeted, 3 more seemed to appear. He saw Kale directing his warriors trying to organize a retreat back toward the cliffs, but it was too late. They were surrounded. Jed. Kale's voice cut through the noise. The old chief was hit, clutching a bloody arm, but his eyes were still fierce. This was a trap for us. They knew we were coming. As if to prove his point, a fresh wave of fire erupted from the mouth of the canyon, cutting off their only escape route. They were boxed in. A searing white-hot poker slammed into Jed's left shoulder. The force of the impact spun him around, and he crashed to the ground, his rifle clattering on the rocks. The world swam. Pain intense and blinding washed over him. He tried to push himself up, his left arm useless, a dead weight. All was beside him, her face a pale mask of terror. "You're hit. It's nothing," he gritted out. But the blood soaking his shirt told a different story. Men were falling. He saw 2 of Kyle's best warriors cut down in a hail of bullets. The rescue had become a slaughter. Through the smoke and chaos, he saw Kale making his way toward them, firing his pistol as he came. "You must go," the old chief yelled, his voice strained with pain and urgency. He shoved a fresh pistol into Jed's good hand. "There is a narrow gorge behind the old mine shaft. It will lead you out of the canyon. Go now." "We're not leaving you," Jed protested, trying to get to his feet. Kale grabbed the front of his shirt, his grip surprisingly strong. He pulled Jed close, his wise old eyes locking onto his. "Your father's debt is paid," he said, his voice dropping low. "Fierce. Now you live. You live and tell the world what these men are. You make sure our fight was not for nothing. Protect the girl. Live." Before Jed could argue, Kale turned and charged back into the fray, letting out a final defiant war cry, drawing the fire of a Halfosen rifles to himself. The sacrifice was a gift of seconds. Jed didn't waste it. He grabs arm with his good hand. Come on. He pulled her toward the dark, gaping maw of the old mine shaft. Bullets chewed at the rocks around them, sending chips of stone flying like shrapnel. They scrambled past the entrance and found the gorge Kyle had spoken of, a crack in the rock face. Barely wide enough for one person, they plunged into the darkness of the narrow passage, just as Cale's last stand ended in a final terrible volley of gunfire. The roar of the battle faded behind them, replaced by the echo of their own ragged breaths and the drumming of their feet on loose rock. They were alive. They were free, but they were wounded, hunted, and more alone than ever before. Trapped, wounded, and betrayed. This is where heroes are made or broken. Comment 6 and tell us if there's any hope left for them. Because in these canyons, survival isn't just about fighting. It's about what you're willing to become. They plunged into the darkness of the narrow passage. Just as Cale's last stand ended in a final, terrible volley of gunfire, the roar of the battle faded behind them, replaced by the echo of their own ragged breaths and the drumming of their feet on loose rock. They were alive. They were free, but they were wounded, hunted, and more alone than ever before. The gorge twisted and turned, a dark, jagged wound in the earth. Jed ran on pure adrenaline, his left arm a throbbing, useless weight. The pain was a living thing, a fire that spread from his shoulder down his side. He ignored it. He pushed it down. Cale's last word echoed in his mind. Live. It was a command, a final sacred duty. Behind them, he could hear shouting. The pursuit had begun. Blackwood's men were fanning out, searching for the escape route. The narrow canyon walls amplified the sounds, making them seem closer than they were. This way, gasped, pulling him toward a fork in the path he hadn't seen. Her knowledge of the land was their only compass now. They scrambled over rocks through thorny brush that tore at their clothes and skin. Jed's vision started to blur at the edges. A cold sweat beaded on his forehead. He was losing too much blood. He stumbled, his legs giving way, and pitched forward. Ara was there, catching him before he hit the ground. Jed, she cried, her voice laced with panic. I'm fine, he lied, pushing himself up, his teeth gritted against a wave of dizziness. He leaned against the cool rock wall, his breath coming in ragged gasps. Just need a minute. But they didn't have a minute. A voice echoed down the canyon, cold and triumphant. Nowhere left to run, boy. Jed's head snapped up. Standing at the entrance to the small circular clearing they'd stumbled into were three figures. Two were brutish, ill-looking thugs with rifles, their faces smeared with dirt and malice. The man in the center was tall and lean, dressed in black. He had a cruel, thin lipped smile and eyes, as cold and dead as a snake's. Silu's Blackwood. I'll give you credit, Blackwood said. His voice a low, conversational drawl that was more terrifying than a yell. He took a slow step forward, his spurs chinking softly on the stone. You and those friends of yours put on quite a show. A real shame about the old chief. He died hard. Rage, pure and hot, burned through the fog of Jed's pain. He pushed himself off the wall, his good hand instinctively reaching for the pistol Cale had given him. He shoved behind him, shielding her with his body. Blackwood's dead eyes flickered down to Jed's hip, a flicker of recognition. Then a slow, greedy smile spread across his face. It wasn't Jed's simple pistol he was looking at. He was looking at the ghost of another gun. He was looking at a legend. Well, I'll be. He breathed, his voice dripping with venomous satisfaction. So, the stories are true. Marshall Stone's boy, hiding out here like a coward. And look what you're carrying. He shook his head in mock sadness. A piece like that deserves better than a washed-up rancher with a hole in his shoulder. Blackwood's smile vanished. His face became a mask of cold, settled hatred. Your father used a gun just like that to kill my brother. Shot him down in the street in dusty little redemption for a crime he never committed. Called it justice. He spat the word out like poison. I call it murder. Seems only fitting I use his son's gun to settle the family debt. This was it. The final confrontation. Not just for the Apache, but for him, for the ghost of his father, for the boy who had died in the fire. Let the girl go, Blackwood, Jed said, his voice steady despite the fire in his shoulder. Your business is with me, Blackwood laughed, a short, ugly bark. The girl? Oh, she's the prize. She's going to tell me all about that Apache silver her people have been hoarding. Then, well, she's not much use after that. He raised his own pistol, aiming it directly at Jed's chest. But first, I'll take care of you. Drop the gun. Jed knew he was outmatched. He was wounded, exhausted. He could maybe get one shot off, but Blackwood and his men would cut them down before he could fire again. He stood his ground, his mind racing, searching for an angle, a chance, anything. He saw a flicker of movement behind Blackwood, a shadow detaching itself from the deeper shadows of the rocks above. Time seemed to slow down. Blackwood's finger tightened on the trigger. Jed prepared to shove to the ground to take the bullet himself. A sound like a hornet whizzed through the air. Blackwood grunted, a look of shocked surprise on his face. He staggered back a step, looking down at his shoulder. An arrow fletched with the feathers of a hawk was sticking out of his arm, just below the shoulder. Before anyone could react, the canyon erupted. From the rocks above, a volley of arrows rained down. One of Blackwood's thugs crumpled to the ground, an arrow buried in his throat. The other screamed and fired his rifle blindly into the cliffs. A figure appeared on a high ledge. It was Cale. He was alive, bleeding heavily but alive, his face a mask of grim determination. Beside him stood the handful of warriors who had survived the ambush. They hadn't run. They had regrouped. They had hunted the hunters. The surviving thug swung his rifle toward Cale, but moved. She had picked up a rock, and with a desperate cry, she threw it, hitting the man in the side of the head. He stumbled, dazed, and that was all the opening Jed needed. He lunged forward, ignoring the searing agony in his shoulder, and crashed into Blackwood. The two men went down in a tangle of limbs. Blackwood's gun flew from his hand, skittering across the rocks. It wasn't a gunfight anymore. It was a brawl, primal and brutal. Jed's good hand found Blackwood's throat. Blackwood's fingers clawed at Jed's wounded shoulder, sending waves of black, sickening pain through him. Jed's vision tunneled. The sounds of the fight around him, the twang of borings, the shouts of the warriors, the screams of the last thug faded into a dull roar. There was only Blackwood's snarling, hate-filled face beneath him. This was the man who had destroyed Outlar's village, the man who had murdered Cale's people, the man who represented every cowardly predator Jed's father had stood against. The rage inside him, the rage he had suppressed for 10 years, exploded. It was the fury of a man who had lost everything. He slammed Blackwood's head against the stone ground. Once, twice, Blackwood's struggles weakened. His eyes, once so full of cold malice, glazed over with a final stunned surprise. Jed rose to his knees, his chest heaving, his body screaming in protest. He looked at his hands raw and bloody. He had not used a gun. He had not used a weapon. He had used the strength that came from a place of deep righteous fury. The fighting was over. The last of Blackwood's men was dead. Cale and his warriors were making their way down from the rocks. Jed looked at Blackwood's body, lying broken at his feet. He felt no triumph, no satisfaction, only a profound, aching emptiness and the quiet, final closing of a chapter he had never wanted to write. The nightmare was over. The monster is dead. The battle is won. But what happens after the last shot is fired? Comment with a 7 if you think this is the end of Jed's fight or just the beginning of a new one. Because peace in the West is often just the quiet moment between storms. The nightmare was over. 3 months later, the Arizona sun felt different. It was still hot, still powerful, but it felt less like a tyrant and more like a promise. The land was healing. With Blackwood's gang shattered, a quiet kind of peace settled back over the territory. The small villages and homesteads that had lived in fear began to breathe again. Jed's ranch was no longer a tomb. It was a place of work, of life. The broken fence posts were mended. The roof no longer sagged. The well, once used by one, now served many. His lonely cabin, once a fortress against the world, had become a crossroads. Cale and his warriors were frequent visitors, bringing hides and stories, sharing coffee and silence on the porch. The ranch became a waypoint, a place of trade, a symbol of the unlikely alliance forged in blood and fire. Outlaw had stayed. After they attended to his wound in their own, she had simply started working. She helped him rebuild. She planted a small garden in the stubborn soil behind the house, coaxing green shoots from the dry earth. Her presence filled the empty spaces in the cabin, her quiet strength a constant reassuring presence. She never spoke of the horrors she had endured, and he never spoke of the fire that had hollowed him out. They didn't need to. Their scars spoke for them. One evening, as the sky once again bled out into shades of crimson and gold, they stood on the small hill overlooking the ranch. Jed's left arm, still stiff, rested in a sling, but the wound was healing. "Your father would be proud of you," Outlaw said softly, her eyes on the distant mountains. Jed's hand went to the gun on his hip, not his own simple weapon. After they had returned from the canyons, he had taken his father's Colt down from the mantle, cleaned it, oiled it, and strapped it on. It felt heavy, but it was a good weight, a familiar weight, a responsibility he no longer ran from. He had not run from his father's legacy. He had finally grown into it. He just did what needed doing, Jed replied, the words coming easier now. A rare small smile touched his lips. "I reckon it's our turn now." He looked at Laura, He didn't see the broken, terrified girl he had found in the dust. He saw a survivor, a partner. He saw a woman whose spirit was as resilient as the green shoots in her garden. In her eyes, he didn't see a past that needed saving, but a future that was waiting to be built together from the ashes. And for the first time in 10 years, Jedodiah Stone looked toward the horizon and felt not emptiness, but hope. Jed's story has found its sunset. If you rode with him to the end, comment 8 and tell us your favorite part of his journey. Your support keeps these legends alive, and we thank you for watching. Now, who's ready for another tale from the Wild West? When the dust settles and the last echo of gunfire fades, Jed's story becomes more than just a tale of survival in the Wild West. It's a story about surviving ourselves. It teaches us that you can build the highest walls and retreat to the most remote corners of your life, but you can never truly outrun the ghosts of your past or the person you were meant to be. Jed's ranch wasn't just a place of solitude. It was a prison he built from grief and fear. So often we do the same. We lock ourselves away from potential pain, believing that isolation is safety, when in reality, it's just a slower kind of death. The true lesson here is that our healing rarely begins in isolation. It begins with a choice. The choice to answer a knock at the door, to offer a stranger a cup of water, to take that first terrifying step back into the world. Jed thought his kindness had once destroyed his life, but it was a renewed act of kindness that ultimately saved him. It reminds us that our purpose is often found not in protecting ourselves, but in connecting with and protecting others. We may not be facing down outlaws like Silas Blackwood, but we all face our own battles. We have our own legacies to confront and our own choice to make. Stay hidden in the safety of the fortress we've built, or step out into the sunlight and fight for something more. That decision is what truly defines us. What lesson did you take away from Jed's journey? Share your thoughts in the comments below. We read everyone. And if these are the kinds of stories that speak to you, make sure you're subscribed to the channel. Thank you for riding with